you all, and I want to first say how much I applaud the work that you do. When I began covering the General Assembly, folks had said, used the cliche to me that, children don't matter down at the Capitol because they don't vote. And I just couldn't possibly believe this, because when you meet legislators one-on-one, they express in theory a great deal of support for children. But what really struck me is how, in practical terms, there is very little legislation, I think, that truly addresses the needs of children. And I hate to acknowledge this, but I think that cliche to some degree, that children don't vote, is in fact true at our legislature. What also happens down at the legislature, I think, is that we have a unique legislature. I've only been involved with legislatures in New Jersey and New York in terms of covering them. And what's different to me about Georgia legislature is there is a great deal of emphasis here on parental rights. And it manifests itself in strange ways. And one of the strangest conversations I ever had was with our lieutenant governor, who told me he really could not support car seats for children 5 or 6, because that was a parental decision whether or not they wanted to use a car seat. And I said, well, it's proven that car seats save lives. Most states have moved to at least age 5. And I realized then that this was sort of a mindset that, that I really couldn't comprehend. I've come to realize it exists now, and I had the same conversation with the governor. So I think that you all probably have seen this firsthand, and it wasn't quite as shocking to you, but over the years I've come to acknowledge that it is very difficult to move the legislature on issues affecting children. I think part of the problem is, and this is one issue that I think you all can address as advocates in the field, part of the issue is that a great deal of information about children is private, is not open to the public, particularly when children are in the child welfare system. What happens there is that the only stories that get out are the truly catastrophic failures. So we don't often get a look at the successes in child welfare, and I think that's one of the reasons we oppose the confidentiality rules that we have here in Georgia regarding juvenile hearings. Because I think people only get the sense that this is a no-win situation, that you can pour money into child welfare, you can pour money into poor children with needs, but there's always going to be problems, and as Roy Barnes once said to me, there's always going to be sorry parents out there. And I think that's true, but I think that obviously there are programs that are working, there are success stories to be told, and I wish we could tell those stories in a better way, because the stories that reach us as in the newspaper and the media are the stories of the Adriana Swain from Cobb County, who is ended up in critical condition, and of course the Terrell Peterson story that my former colleague Jane Hansen turned into a national story. And I think we have to tell those stories, obviously, but the inability, I think, to tell the success stories in detail with children's faces, with names, hampers us, because we have a commitment. Readers believe stories when they can see, sort of touch and feel the people. So writing a story about child A and not being able to give any information or show photographs undermines the telling of the story. So I think that's something that you can work on as advocates. You may in fact you may be in a program that is not hampered by the confidentiality laws of the state regarding children. And if that's the case, then I think you need to try very hard to identify families or children whose stories can be shared, that are success stories, that the child and the family will not be endangered by that, by getting the information out there. So I welcome you all bringing stories to me about policies and programs that you think are successful, but what I really need you to do is to identify for me, or help me identify, faces that we can put on those stories. I just think it is a lot more interesting to read a story, to get the public into a story. I mean, Gennaro Wilson, what made that story sort of successful and what made his outcome work, I think, is that it was a story that he was willing to tell, his family was willing to tell, his lawyer was willing to tell, and when you can actually say our sex offender laws are cockeyed, which I've said many, many times, it is a lot easier to say that when you can pull a case up. And I'm still writing about sex offender laws, and I'm using now the case of Wendy Whitaker, who at 17, she had just turned 17, made a truly stupid decision to perform oral sex on a classmate who was a couple weeks shy of turning 16. and that has landed her on the sex offender registry for life. She's now in her late 20s, married, and is, with the help of the Southern Center for Human Rights, she is trying hard to hold on to her house, to live there in South Georgia, but it is close to a daycare center, and so she, because on the registry, can't legally live there. But that's a kind of case, I mean, telling Wendy's story is a very effective way of getting that across. So I ask you to think about that when you are coming to the media with something that you think is worth telling. I think there is a mindset at the Capitol, at least from my 12 years down there, that child welfare is a losing proposition. That you can change things, but you'll still be suffer a headline somewhere at some time about a child that was inappropriately placed and ended up either near death or, dead. And those are the only children whose names actually are released, are those severe cases. So I think that the legislature has developed this attitude of there's nothing we can do. This is always going to be the case. So I think that the challenge for all of you and for those of us in the media who would like to see child welfare both get a higher profile and higher funding is to point out that, in fact, this is not a given, that these children, that there do not have to be the horrendous cases, and that there can be successful placement of children, and new policies do make a difference. So again, that is my challenge, that you all think about that. There's a little bit of that mindset now in education as well in the legislature. For those of you who follow education, one of the interesting evolutions now is that the legislature seems to have decided there's not much that they can do with traditional schools, public schools. So they are going down the path of sort of giving the responsibility to schools to other people. And they're doing that in a couple of ways. The way that is gaining the most steam is the charter school movement. And I support charter schools, even though the charter school movement would not agree with me on that, because I was very critical of the last session in which almost all the school legislation that got passed dealt with charter schools. My issue simply is that there are many, many more traditional standard public schools, and you have to look at ways to improve those schools, and simply renaming them charter schools, which is the new form of reform down at the Capitol, is not going to do it. If you don't look at the issues of teacher quality, of school size, of curriculum, of interventions, of early childhood education, of getting, I'm very proud of our 4-year-old program, although it has stalled, and we are now have been eclipsed by a couple other states in terms of their early childhood numbers and what they're doing. We need to expand it to at-risk 3-year-olds, and we probably should copy France and move down to 2-year-olds eventually. And it's that kind of thing that the legislature didn't grapple with at all last year. All they talked about was, let's allow schools to become charter schools. Let's allow charter schools to open even over the opposition of the local Board of Education. And I recognize that some local Board of Educations have been, in fact, opponents and hostile to charter schools. But I think there's a remedy for that, and that is that the local community votes out their Board of Education. To me, the state is not in a position to tell towns across the state, you have got to, state government rather, is not in a position to tell them, you've got to put a charter school in, even though your locally duly elected school board is opposed to them for some reason. For example, and again, I understand why the parents want this. Gwinnett County turned down a single gender academy. And I went to a couple presentations about it. It looked like a pretty good idea. But in their approach to education, they simply don't want to go down the single gender route. And the sponsor, the people that want to open the school, appealed to the state commission. Commission overruled Gwinnett, and that school will open. A law change last year requires that school not only get the state money, but also local dollars. My issue with that is only that a school system has developed an approach to education. And in the case of Gwinnett County, I would say that given their circumstances, they're a fairly successful school system. We will see if their new bid for, they just want new flexibility that allows them to break away from many state mandates, and we'll see if that does what they say. But anyway, my only concern about that is that a school system may have